So this value, when we consult the status, it has to be formatted so that the user can get some kind of meaning from it, so that it makes sense to the user. And with the following elements, this is what we're doing. For example, with simple response elements, the numeric response would be connected to a text, so that if we're talking about lighting, the status could be 0. 0 would mean that the light is off, and 1 is that the light is on. And with the response range, what we do is we have, just like with the previous one, but it's for ranges. So we could have a blind, which is, for example, 0 to 25 is that it's down, and between 25 and 50 that it's up. And the last one, just the response, this could be, for example, the numeric value. For example, the thermostat, 21 would be 21 degrees. And so we would have to encapsulate the response. We have to make sure that it's something that the user can really understand. So if the number was 21, the actual response would have to be, the temperature is 21 degrees, so that they know what the 21 refers to. Here, if we talk about the navigation lists or browsing lists, and in this way we define elements such as navigation. This element should be something that contains other elements. So navigation may contain or would contain the menu and launcher, for example. The menu would be the access point by which the user could access another navigation list, whereas launcher, as we said before, would be the link between the two descriptions, the user interface and the services. For example, in what we can see here on the right, we could have a representation of a user interface, and we can see that on the right-hand side of this tree, we've got light 1, this would be the launcher, and if this element was defined as belonging to the lighting system, then when the user accesses it, the next screen would be the functionality defined according to lighting services. This would be in the previous description, obviously. And as you can see on the tree, you can see how the navigation contains different elements through which you access other lists for navigation, and this contains the launchers. The launcher is the language itself, not this tree chart or this flow chart. So if we have the launcher, if we talk about load launchers, these are dynamic elements. In this flow chart, the launchers appear as part of the description, but this wouldn't really be the case. And we'd have the load launcher, which could load a file. For example, on the left hand of the flowchart, this contains all devices in the home. We could have a load launcher element, which would load all of the devices, whereas on the right, the devices would be loaded. In one case, for example, the lighting, or in another case, it would be the doors, so that in some way the launcher, you could have light 1 repeated in different occasions, but in this case, it would be defined just once. With this language, we've done a study for an interface, developing an interface for visually impaired people. The interface has been created using the language that we've seen, and we have the interpreter, which is all about processing this language. The platform that we chose to use for this development was Android, and the communication between the user and the interface was a touch screen with 4 gestures, so they could navigate using the movement of the thumb towards the right, which would move them onto the next menu. If it went to the left, they go to the previous menu. Downwards, they'd go into the navigation elements related to the menu. And upwards, they'd go back to the previous navigation element. If the user navigates through this interface, they're offered feedback using text-to-speech. We have different things to convert text to speech. First of all, from text to speech from the user. Another implementation we've called external, and that would be in the home, and reproduction would be in the device itself, in the terminal. So if terminals don't have the capacity, well, another implementation, it will be done in the home services. So if you're using this text-to-speech, or these speech services would come over the loudspeakers in the digital home. Using this interface, the user can control the services available in their home and increase their independence within the home. Here we've got two examples, but I'm not going to go into detail because we haven't got enough time. On the left, it would be a description of the interface user, and on the right, one of the elements or some of the elements called launchers. And this is another example. This is a description of home services, and here we're talking about lighting in this particular example. What's more, according to the concepts, we've tried to develop a visual interface, and it just consists of having an interpreter which takes the interface and turns it into something visual. Here, as you can see, we've got on the left the list of navigation, the menu, and by using that, by using the second element, we go on to the next screen, the next navigation screen, with the places, the rooms or areas in the home. And if we choose lounge, which is marked in orange, salon, if we chose this, then we'd move on and see the launchers or the devices which are located in that room, in the lounge. And this is the hierarchy that's been developed or followed for this interface, classified by rooms and also by services. So if you want to access lights, you don't have to know exactly in which room it is, but rather that it's just a light. You go in via the third element, which is C, devices classified by service. And so with regards to conclusions, well, to finish off, I want to position or talk about the language developed, to position it in this. We can see it in DAI middleware and the integration layer, which takes all the technology from the bottom. And in this way, you have the UIDL language, and the interfaces will be described, and each interpreter would be able to get descriptions and distance them, so that when we have new platforms, the interpreters could be used to make sure that previous systems were still usable. So, by way of conclusion, we would say that the language presented is sufficient to be able to develop user interfaces for remote control in a quick way. And the definition of launchers allows us to describe dynamic user interfaces, because if we're talking about services and interface, the descriptions are the same, but with launchers it could be different, and that makes it dynamic, makes it a dynamic interface. And accessibility depends on the interpreter, as we've called it, and it's the interpreter who decides the type of interface it's going to generate. So if it decides that it should be responsible of offering the elements necessary for the user to use the interface, it will be based on that description. And lastly, Obviously, via the interface, we can access the home services within the intelligent home or the smart home. If we talk about current and future work, the validation of UIs with users, this is something that's going to be done very soon. We have the support for platforms. We have the platform Android, but we are also working with iOS platforms or systems. We would have to look also we'd have to look at the locution modes for the user interface, for example, voice messages, and whether the user navigates using these or not. It would be interesting if we're looking at navigation, all of the interface elements could produce a locution for the user. This is something that could be positive. Also, for future work, we could enrich the language with new elements to increase its descriptive capacity, and other resources that would not be textual, for example, graphic elements, audio elements. So these interpreters, when they generate the interface, they would have more resources available to make richer resources available. And lastly, internationalization. This now depends on the interpreter, but the problem is that the translations of the interfaces, well, each interpreter could interpret them as it saw fit, so it could vary according to the interpreter. If we incorporate this part into the language, then indeed, between one interpreter and the other, it could be the same interpretation, and they would all be interusable. And that's all.